Have you ever watched a slice of life or high school anime? These shows capture everyday Japanese life in almost painful details. The classroom chatter, the shrine visit on New Year's, the summer festival with yukata and fireworks. But maybe you've wondered, wait, what do these people actually believe? Are they Buddhist, Shinto, atheist, or something else? In this video, let's dig into the Japanese view of religion. Not just what they do, but why they think the way they do. If you walk through Japan, you will notice something strange. A black torii gate marking a Shinto shrine, a Buddhist temple nearby with incense drifting through the air, and then out of nowhere, a hotel wedding chapel designed like a European church. If you ask someone on the street, "Are you religious?" most people will shrug and say, no, really. But then, that same person might visit a shrine on New Year's, hold a Buddhist funeral for their grandparents, celebrate Christmas with cake and KFC, and get married in a white dress with a fake priest. From the outside, it looks contradictory, almost like they're mixing religion without thinking. But inside Japan, this feels normal, natural, and not confusing at all. To understand why, we have to go back to a time when the Japanese language didn't even have a word for religion. Around 2 to 3,000 years ago, the earliest form of what we now call Shinto began to take shape in Japan. But what emerged at this time was not a religion. It was a way of sensing the world, a fundamental method of forming relationship with it. And understanding this point matters, because knowing Shinto is key to understanding how Japanese people have perceived the world, how they have behaved within it, and what they have taken for granted. Okay, ChatGPT. Then what kind of worldview was beginning to grow?
People started feel that the world around them was alive with presence. Not a single almighty God, but countless forms of coming forces, moods, or powers residing in the land itself. The mountain that protected a village, the river that gave life its spring and destroyed homes in autumn, the ancient tree that stood longer than any memories, the ancestors who continue to exist within the family. This wasn't belief, it was recognition.
Thanks, but why did this worldview arise? Because life in ancient Japan was shaped by a landscape that could nurture or annihilate you in the same belief. Earthquakes without warning, typhoons tearing across the coast, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, a natural world impossible to control, but impossible to ignore. To survive, communities needed more than tool. They needed a relationship with land, with the season, with unseen force that shaped their fate. So Shinto emerged as a set of behaviors rather than doctrines, keeping space clean, offering gratitude, respecting circles of purity and impurity, performing ritual together as a village. These weren't private acts. They were communal strategies for living. In truth, Japanese worldview at this stage was not unique. Many ancient societies lived in a world where ritual, survival, and community were fused into a single way of life. Before monotheistic religion emerged, most of the world assumed countless spirits dwelling in the nature and the land, a fundamentally polytheistic way of understanding existence. East Asia, Southeast Asia, ancient Europe, and the early society of the Middle East. Everywhere, prayer and daily life were inseparable. Japan was simply part of this broader global pattern. So then, what exactly began to push Japan onto a different path from other civilizations? The first force that started to set Japan on this new trajectory was the arrival of Buddhism. Around the 6th century, Japan encountered something radically new: Buddhism carried from the Asian continent through Korea and China, and unlike many places where new religion erased the old one, Japan didn't wipe anything out. Japan added Buddhism as a new layer. To understand why, we need to look at what Buddhism brought, what Shinto already did, and the conflict Japan was facing when Buddhism first arrived. When Buddhism entered Japan, it arrives with a full set of ideas and practices. A philosophy of suffering, desire, impermanence, a structured explanation of death and the afterlife, ritual for funerals and ancestor memorials, images, sculptures, and sophisticated art, and the literate, intellectual culture of China. For Japan's elite, this wasn't just a religion, it was a tool of statecraft, a sign of connection to a more advanced continent. Shinto organized life around survival and harmony with nature, life event, fertility and agriculture, protection of the community, and gratitude to the kami in the land. But Shinto didn't have a developed answer for what happened after you die, why suffering exists, or how to escape the cycle of misfortune. Buddhism filled that gap perfectly, so Shinto handled life, and Buddhism handled death. No collision, just two systems occupying different territories. But when Buddhism entered Japan in the 6th century, it didn't simply fit. At first, it fractured the country, and the meaning of that conflict was very different depending on who you are. To understand why Buddhism was eventually embraced, we must look two separate layers of society. One, the political elite, the clans who fought over Buddhism law. Two, the ordinary people who struggle to make sense of war, loss, and uncertainty. Let's take each one clearly. For ruling clans, Buddhism wasn't just a set of teaching, it was a geopolitical tool. The Sogakuren, they saw Buddhism as a gateway to the highly developed world of China and Korea. They wanted literacy, architecture, administrative knowledge, and continental prestige. Support for Buddhism was a way to modernize the states and increase their own political power. The Mononobe and Nakatomi clans. To them, Buddhism was a threat to the traditional authority of Shinto ritual specialists, the relationship with local kami, and their own political influence. They believed fallen gods could provoke the anger of native kami and bring disaster, which aligned with their political interest as the guardians of Shinto ritual. This disagreement escalated into armed conflict. Temples were burned, statues smashed, warriors fought and died. For the elite, the conflict was about who controlled religious authority, what kind of state Japan wanted to become, and how closely Japan should align with the continent. When the Sogakuren eventually won, the states officially learned toward Buddhism. It became part of elite culture, part of governing ideology, and a sign that Japan was joining the broader Asian civilization. But for ordinary people, farmers, villagers, artisans, the conflict had a very different effect. They didn't care about diplomacy with China. They weren't thinking about building a centralized state. What they feared was violence between clans, unpredictable political tension, fear that the world was changing too fast, anxiety about the future, the vulnerability of life surrounded by disasters. This was a society that already lived close to nature, close to death, and close to catastrophe. So when they experienced political conflict erupting in front of them, it wasn't a matter of ideology, it was personal. And Buddhism offered a powerful answer. It taught that suffering has causes, that violence leaves karmatic consequences, that compassion can break the cycle, and that death is not the end, but a passage. For people living through trauma, these ideas weren't abstract philosophy. They were a way to make sense of grief and fear. For elite, Buddhism was a tool of statecraft. For ordinary people, Buddhism was a tool of emotional survival. Two different needs, one religion filling both. After the Soga victory, the ruling class institutionalized Buddhism, building temple, inviting scholars, sponsoring monks. But Buddhism would not have taken deep roots if ordinary people had not also embraced it for their own reason. So the acceptance of Buddhism was not only top-down, it was also bottom-up. The elite adapted it for politics and culture. The people adapted it for healing and meaning. These two movements met in the middle, allowing Buddhism to become a major part of Japanese life without replacing Shinto. And this dual acceptance is a key reason why Japan developed a blended, layered religious identity rather than a binary one. If they tried to replace Shinto, they would have reignited the same tension that caused the war. The local shrine, the kami, the festival, these were deeply tied to community life. Erasing them would have fractured the country again. So the most practical and peaceful solution was keep Shinto, adapt Buddhism, and let them cover different roles. That's why almost immediately after the conflict, we start seeing shrine and temple standing side by side. People didn't abandon their kami. They simply added Buddhism idea on top of what they already had. And soon, a natural logic took hold. Shinto took care of a life season and the land. Buddhism took care of death, ancestor, and the mind. Once the division settled in, the two systems didn't clash. They completed each other. This is why Japan blended them instead of replacing one with the other. Everything has its place. Nothing needs to dominate. And harmony matters more than purity. But eventually, even this long-standing harmony began to crack. For over 1,000 years, Japan lived inside a blended spiritual world where Shinto and Buddhism didn't fight for dominance. They cooperated. Shrines and temples stood side by side, ritual intertwined, and people moved between the two systems without hesitation. It wasn't a matter of loyalty, it was a symbol, the natural structure of everyday life. But in the late 19th century, during the Meiji Restoration, that balance was abruptly and deliberately broken. To understand why, we have to look at the geopolitical crisis Japan faced at the time. By the mid-1800s, Western imperial powers were carving up Asia. China had been defeated in Opium Wars. India had fallen under British wars. Western warships were appearing on Japanese shore. The message was clear: adapt first or be swallowed. The Meiji leaders believed Japan had only one chance to modernize at extraordinary speed, not gradually, not carefully, but explosively. They were trying to build a centralized state, a modern army, a unified school system, and most importantly, a single national identity. But here, they hit a philosophical problem. Japan's spiritual world was a patchwork, layered across centuries. Shinto equal local, place-based, tied to nature and the empire. Buddhism equal traditional, textual, intellectually sophisticated. Folk beliefs, countless regional customs and rituals. Confucian ethics embedded in social order and education. To Western observers, this looked chaotic. To Meiji elite trying to negotiate with Western diplomats, it looked weak and indecisive. You cannot build a strong nation-state, they argued, if future foundation is mixed. So the government made a strategic and almost surgical decision. Shinto would be elevated as a true and original soul of Japan. Buddhism would be downgraded as a foreign add-on. This was not a theological judgment, It was a political technology for state building. Shinto offers something extremely convenient for modernizing states, an ancient mythological origin for the Japanese people, a divine genealogy for the empire, a narrative of cultural uniqueness, emotionally powerful ties to land, ancestry, and territory. By contrast, Buddhism carried foreign roots, Indian origin, Chinese interpretation, monk connected through Pan-Asian network, and temple that held enormous wealth and land. Two Meiji leaders. Buddhism looked like a potential rival power structure that needed to be weakened. So the states launched an aggressively formed program known as Shinbutsu, the legal separation of the Shinto and Buddhism. The goal was not just to reorganize religious institutions, but to manufacture a clear ideological hierarchy. What had been blended for centuries was forcibly pulled apart. Shrine and temples once intertwined were legally separated. Places that had enshrined Kami and Buddhism together were ordered to choose a single identity. Buddhist images were removed from shrine. Shinto symbols were stripped out of temples. Priests and monks who had long cooperated were suddenly told their connection was illegal. The anti-Buddhist movement known as Haibutsu erupted, leading to destruction of thousands of temples, statues, sutras, and artworks. What's crucial here is that none of this emerged from the grassroots. Ordinary people didn't suddenly develop ideological hostility toward Buddhism. These reforms were top-down, driven by officials who believed the state needed a simple, unified narrative to stand alongside Western nations. And the narrative they crafted was powerful. Shinto is purely Japanese. The empire is descended from the sun god. Buddhism is fallen and weakened Japan. Whether this story was historically accurate was irrelevant. What mattered was utility. Through this ideological lens, Shinto was re-emerging not as a local, puristic collection of village rituals, but as a national mythos, a tool to bind every citizen to the empire and the states. It's important to understand that this transformation created a Shinto that had never existed before. State Shinto, the system taught in school, promoted by the government, and used to mobilize national loyalty, was a modern invention. It borrowed ancient elements, yes, but it packed them into a centralized ideology for modern nation-states. However, the Meiji government's attempt to control and reshape religion did not last forever. In 1955, Japan was defeated in the war, and at the moment, the Allied powers imposed a crucial requirement on Japan: the Shinto Directive. The Shinto Directive was an order that prohibited the Japanese government from using Shinto. It wasn't because they wanted to interfere with personal belief of the Japanese people. What the Allies feared was only one thing: the possibility that the machinery of state Shinto could once again mobilize the population for war. Before the war, state Shinto was not a religion in the usual sense. It was the central ideology of the nation-states. It defined the empire as a descendant of the gods, emphasized Japanese unique destiny, and used education, rituals, and laws to imprint this worldview onto every citizen. So even in the chaos immediately after Japan's defeat, the Allies concluded unless this structure is dismantled, the same narrative could drive the nation into militarism again. The result was the December 1955 Shinto Directive. What's crucial is that the directive did not ban Shinto itself, but banned the state's use of Shinto for political purpose. In other words, it destroyed state Shinto, but left Shinto as everyday practice intact. This distinction would shape the entire structure of religion in post-war Japan. Yet the Meiji reforms were only the first rupture. The next and far more decisive transformation came after Japan's defeat in 1955, when the entire religious system was forced to reset under a completely new political order. So what happened after state Shinto was dismantled? Surprisingly, main things survived: shrine buildings, annual festivals, New Year's shrine visit, Shichigo-san, local matsuri, Shinto priest, community custom. Then why do they remain? The reason is simple. These practices were rooted not as religion but as everyday culture habit. So even after the war, Shinto-like gesture and rituals continued normally in daily life. However, the core element of state Shinto were thoroughly removed. Shinto aspect disappeared from state ceremony. Religious narrative were removed from education. National holidays were completely reorganized. The empire became a symbol, not a divine being. At the political level, the state use of Shinto vanished entirely. But at the level of everyday life, Shinto practice survived as culture, not religion. So what's happened to Buddhism? This is where the major post-war transformation begins. With the emperor-centered state Shinto dismantled, Buddhism was finally released from its long-standing tension with the states. Before the war, Buddhism had lived under competition with state Shinto, pressure to cooperate with wartime mobilization, political surveillance. After the war, all of these constraints disappeared. But Buddhism did not gain new political support. Instead, it faced the harsh realities. The collapse of the traditional parishioner system due to urbanization, changes in family structure, decreased sentiment outside funerals, and a general decline in religious interest among the youth. In other words, after the end of state Shinto, Buddhism gained freedom but lost stability. As a result, it gradually became confined to knowledge lore, what is often called funeral Buddhism, politically related but socially pushed toward a specific faction. Before the war, shrine visits and seasonal rituals were not viewed as religion, but as everyday customs. But once state Shinto was removed from public institution and education, a new definition took hold. Religion equals personal belief and individual choice. As a result, many Japanese began to say, "I'm not religious," while continuing the same Shinto-based practices as before, now understood as culture, not faith. After state Shinto collapsed, Shinto returned to local life as tradition, festivals, and cultural identity. Buddhism, meanwhile, faced urbanization and family changes, and gradually gnawed into a more specific lore, funerals and ancestor memorials. This created a distinctly Japanese pattern. In other words, non-religious self-perception and multi-religious practice coexist without contradiction. Because state Shinto had been tied to wartime nationalism, the post-war atmosphere created an implicit caution. Religion can be dangerous when connected to power. This produced the characteristic post-war attitudes, avoiding strong religious claims, keeping personal faith private, skepticism toward any religion-politics connection, maintaining emotional distance from religion. As a result, both Shinto and Buddhism continued, but as gentle, cultural practices rather than assertive belief system. Japan's religious worldview is shaped by an ancient layer of nature versus spirituality and ancestral reverence, with Buddhism added not as replacement but as additional layer that fulfilled different humans' needs. The Meiji era then forced an artificial separation between Shinto and Buddhism for political purpose, and after World War II, state Shinto was dismantled, reshaping how religion was understood altogether. Through this transformation, modern Japan developed its distinctive pattern, Shinto as culture, Buddhism as ritual, and both coexist effortlessly in everyday life. But this is only part of the story. Post-war Japan also saw the rise of Christianity, new religious movements, each adding new influences to the Japanese religious mindset. In the next video, we'll explore how these other religions shaped modern Japan, and what they reveal about the deeper structure of Japanese belief. So thank you for watching. If you have any thought or opinion, feel free to leave a comment. On this channel, I will explore Japanese culture, customs, and ideas by tracing them back to their origin. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. So thank you for watching.